Hello, welcome to Algebra 2. Go ahead, turn your books to page 500. Go to lesson 76, multiplying radical expressions. Radical are simply square root signs. We are going to go ahead and solve these. The first thing you need to know is product rule. When you have two factors underneath the radical, you can separate them just like so right there. Or if you have two different radicals and you're multiplying them, you can multiply everything underneath the radical and bring them together. For example 1, we're going to go ahead and multiply. So this applies to the second part of the rule. If you have two separate radicals, that is equal to the product, meaning you're multiplying the two underneath the radical. So radical 8 times radical 2 is equal to radical 8 times 2. That is equal to radical 16. And what I do is you can double check in your calculator to see if it's a whole number. If it's not a whole number, that means it's not a perfect square. Then you have to simplify it if you can. In this case, the square root of 16, that's a perfect square. That is equal to 4. Next one, 6 radical 2 times 4 radical 2. When you are multiplying these, you can multiply the whole numbers, so the outside numbers, and you can also multiply the numbers underneath the radical. So now we have 6 times 4, that's the two outside numbers, times everything underneath the radical, which is 2 and 3. This will give you 24 radical 6. Always look at it and see if you need to simplify anymore. Radical 6, the only factors of radical 6 or square root of 6 is 2 and 3 and 1 and 6. You always try to look for factors that one of them is a perfect square. So if you have your list from what I gave you in the beginning of the year, it starts with 0, 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49, and it goes so on and so on. That will give you the perfect square. So if you have a factor, then you can simplify even more. But in this case, 6, that's as simplified as you can get. Next one, 6 radical 3 squared. Whenever you have a square, especially parentheses, that means you have to square everything, every factor between the parentheses. There are two factors. There's a 6 and the radical 3. So I separated here. So 6 squared is 36. And for this over here, you have radical 3 squared. Whenever you have a radical, to cancel out a radical, you have to square root it. Just like a square root, to cancel out that square root, you have to square root both sides for the square. So multiplication, division, they go hand in hand. Radicals and exponents, the same power exponents, they also go hand in hand. So a cube root will cancel out with a cube. So now here, these two cancel out and you're left with 3. So then you have 36 times 3. Everything is in terms of multiplication. And you multiply that and you get 108. D, we have 2 times radical 6x times radical 4x. You multiply the outside numbers, which is just 2. And then you multiply everything underneath the radical times 4x. Now we go ahead and simplify, just making sure I have it correctly. Yep. Go ahead and simplify, and you get 2 radical 24x squared. You can't stop there. You have to see if anything underneath the radical can be simplified. So if I were to separate it, I get radical 24 and the square root of x squared. Here, automatically the x squared cancels out and you're just left with an x. But now the square root of 24, if I were to pull this to the side, we have to find factors of 24 with one of them being a perfect square. So if we're looking for the different numbers, there is multiple factors of 24, but you're looking for one of them being a perfect square. And the one I can think of is 4 and 6. The reason why, because 4 is a perfect square. That is equal to whole number 2, and square root of 6, you cannot simplify it. You get 2 radical 6. So then you get 2 times square root of 24, if you simplify it, it's 2 radical 6, times a square root of x squared. The root and the power, they cancel out and you're left with x. Then you simplify it. 2 times 2 radical 6 is 4 radical 6 times x. This gives you 4x radical 6. This x is not underneath the radical because it doesn't have a radical with it, so you have to include it with the whole numbers or the outside numbers. So your answer is 4x radical 6. Example 2, now we're dealing with distributive property. So you have to multiply the outside term to each term between the parentheses. So radical 2 times 3 gives you 3 radical 2. Radical 2 times radical 6 gives you plus 12. They're both radicals. You multiply everything underneath the radical, you get radical 12. Here, it looks like we can simplify it because the square root of 12, if I take it to the side, this is equal to different factors, but the factor you're looking for is one of them having a perfect square, and the one I'm thinking of is 4 and 3. This can be simplified to 2 radical 3. So then another way I can write this is 3 radical 2 plus, you just bring the sign down, 2 radical 3. So this converts to the 2 radical 3. Now, looking at this, the numbers underneath the radical, they're different, so therefore you don't add them. So what you do is you just leave them as is, and you leave them like there. So just like terms, if there is 5x plus 3x, that's equal to 8x. If you have the same radical, that means the radical with the same number underneath, you can add the numbers in front, but in this case, radical 2, radical 3, 2 completely different numbers. B, same thing, but before we do that, it looks like here radical 2 times radical 6 minus 9. This radical 9 is a perfect square, so we don't even, let's go ahead and make it less complicated. So radical 2 times radical 6 minus 3. Square root of 9 is a perfect square. I always want to get rid of perfect squares as much as I can. So here, I can get rid of it. I go ahead and use distributive property. Radical 2 times radical 6 is radical 12. Radical 2 times negative 3 gives you negative 3 radical 2. Or radical 2 times 3, just bring the sign down, and then you get this. Again, you do not stop there. You always have to simplify radicals. Here, we already simplified the square root of 12, so that means it's going to be 2 radical 3 minus 3 radical 2. You cannot add the like terms or the like radicals because there are 2 different numbers underneath the radicals. Example 3, now we're dealing with FOIL. So I'm going to put FOIL up here first, outside, inside, last. So here, if you look at this 4 plus radical 9 times 2 minus radical 6, this could be simplified. Radical 9, again, perfect squares, simplify as much as you can. Now I have 4 plus 3 times 2 minus radical 6. You want to make it easy. This looks like I can combine it to make it easier, and I do. 7 times 2 radical 6 is what I end up with. That's easier to factor out than this. You could use FOIL and solve this out. It should give you the same answers, but in this case, it's easier for me. It's easier for you guys too. So then you go ahead and multiply using distributive property. So you get 14 minus 7 radical 6, and then that's your answer. You cannot simplify, you cannot combine them. In order for you to combine them, the 14 has to have a radical 6. It does not, so therefore you separate them. B, this is where you have the squared. This one and this one are 2 completely different things, and the reason why they're different is because of their signs. This, they're multiplying 6 radical 3, 6 times radical 3. Here we have 6 minus radical 3. So if you have a plus or minus sign between those parentheses and you're squaring it, that means it's the same binomial times the other binomial, exactly how it's written. So that's why I have here. Now you use FOIL, first, outside, inside, last. I have the numbers here. You can screenshot it. You can zoom in more. Let me go ahead and turn this. All right. 6 times 6, 36. 6 times radical 3 minus 6 radical 3. Negative radical 3 times 6. So 1, 2, 3. Negative radical 3 times 6 is negative 6 radical 3. And then negative radical 3 times negative radical 3 gives you positive because they're both negative, but it's going to be radical 3 squared. Another way you can look at it is they are both square roots. So negative or radical 3 times radical 3 gives you the square root of 9, and the square root of 9 is 3. Or it's the same number, so if you're multiplying it twice, it's the same thing as writing radical 3 squared because now this cancels out. So now I have 36. This looks like I can combine the terms. So I get minus 12 radical 3 plus this, those two cancel out, the square root cancels out. You don't bring that root down. So then you're left with this. To simplify this even more, you combine terms and get 39 minus 12 radical 3. You cannot add any like terms, so therefore that's your answer there. Last one, you have a shape here. It's a story problem. In this case, what you're trying to find is the area of this whole plot right here. So to find the area, this is the length and the width over here. To find the area, you multiply those two. So therefore, I'm multiplying these two right here. So this is another example of using FOIL. So now you do 8 times 2. I have my arrows. I have them labeled. If you don't remember, go back to the lesson. So 8 times 2, 16. 8 times radical 2 is 8 radical 2. Radical 5 times 2 gives you 2 radical 5. Again, this is not underneath the radical, so therefore you're not multiplying the 5 and the 2. Radical 5 times radical 2, if you want to make it easier, I could just do radical 10 and multiply the numbers underneath both radicals because they are radicals. That's why I can multiply them. Here I have like terms. I have a like term right there. So therefore, I actually have no like terms. I have 16 plus 8 radical 2 plus 2 radical 5 plus radical 10. Nothing here you can simplify. So this is all the answer, b squared. Whenever you're doing these type of work in your homework, never put the measurement here. Always just put the number. All I need is the number. I don't need anything extra. So if you guys have any more questions, make sure you're always looking down here in the drop box. I always try to put new things, things that you need to know. Again, those worksheets need to be turned in by today. Brother John will be going by every house and picking them all up. If I don't have them by Thursday or even by Friday, that is considered zeros on all your worksheets. There's about 4 or 5 worksheets. That's a lot of zeros. Bye. We're gonna learn how to wash our hands. Step 1, pump, 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 pump. All right, my assistant's gonna help me with some extra. Go ahead and spray me. We need some extra protection. There you go, thank you. Scrub, 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 scrub-a-dub-dub, rub-a-dub-a-dub. Through the fingers.
Damn hair is dope.
Oh no, clean that too. Then you go and you wash it. Then you clean.